The early 19th century in London was a world where your last name determined your destiny. If you were born in Mayfair, the doors of the Royal Institution opened for you. If you were born in the slums of Newington Butts, those doors were locked and bolted. One boy, the son of a blacksmith, was born into a house of starvation. He had no schooling, no wealth, and no future. Yet this delivery boy would go on to invent the modern world. This is the story of Michael Faraday. Faraday wasn't just poor, he was the son of a blacksmith who was often too sick to work. The family lived on the edge of starvation, sometimes surviving on a single loaf of bread for an entire week. Education was a luxury they couldn't afford. Michael learned the basics of reading and counting, but at 13, he was sent to work to put food on the table. He started as a delivery boy for a bookseller, carrying newspapers through the foggy, cold-choked streets of London. It was grueling, thankless work, but it led him to the bookbinding shop of George Rebow. For most boys, Rebow's shop would have been a prison of manual labor. You stitched pages, glued covers, and kept your head down. But for Faraday, it was a sanctuary. It was his university. While other apprentices spent their evenings at the pub, Michael stayed behind. He was surrounded by the towering stacks of books he was supposed to be binding. He didn't just bind them, he devoured them. One book ignited a fire in his mind that no poverty could extinguish. Conversations on Chemistry by Jane Marcet. It wasn't a dry academic text. It was written for beginners, explaining the mysteries of reactions in a way that made sense to a boy with no schooling. He read it, then he read it again. He spent his meager earnings on chemicals to test the experiments. He built a small laboratory in the back of the shop, turning glass bottles and old pans into scientific instruments. Reading wasn't enough. Faraday wanted to be part of the world he saw in those pages. He started attending lectures by the great scientists of the day. He paid a shilling to sit in the back row. He took meticulous records of every word, every experiment, and every flash of insight. He copied diagrams with the precision of a draftsman. Over time, these notes grew into a 300-page manuscript, bound by his own hands. This wasn't just a notebook. It was his application letter to the universe. In 1812, fate intervened. A customer at the shop gave Faraday a ticket to see Humphrey Davy, the superstar of British science. Davy was everything Faraday wasn't: wealthy, celebrated, and established. But Faraday saw something else in Davy, a kindred spirit who believed in experimentation. After the lectures, Faraday did something audacious. He sent his 300-page book to Davy with a letter asking for a job. He didn't ask to be a scientist. He asked to wash bottles or sweep floors. He just wanted to be near the science. Davy was impressed, but the class divide was still a wall. He told Faraday to stick to bookbinding, saying science was a harsh mistress for a poor man. But then, an accident in the lab left Davy temporarily blinded. He needed an assistant. He remembered the boy with the beautiful handwriting and the boundless curiosity. Michael Faraday was hired. He entered the Royal Institution not as a peer, but as a servant. Yet he had his foot in the door. The blacksmith's son had walked out of the bindery and into the laboratory, armed with nothing but a mind that refused to accept its place. In 1813, Sir Humphrey Davy decided to embark on a grand tour of Europe. This was a monumental scientific expedition through the intellectual capitals of France and Italy. He needed an assistant to help with experiments and record observations. He asked Michael Faraday. For a young man who had never been more than a few miles from London, this was the opportunity of a lifetime. It was a chance to stand in the laboratories of legends and witness the cutting edge of science firsthand. Faraday accepted immediately, his heart pounding with the thrill of adventure. He didn't know that this trip would come with a price tag of humiliation. Davy's personal valet refused to go at the last minute because he was afraid of Napoleon's France. Davy turned to Faraday and asked him to act as his valet until they could find a replacement. Faraday, desperate not to lose his position, agreed. He thought it would be temporary. He thought his value as a scientist would eventually outshine his role as a servant. He was wrong. The real villain of this chapter was Davy's wife, Jane A. Priest Davy. She was a wealthy socialite, acutely aware of her status. To her, Michael Faraday was not a promising scientist. He was a servant who was getting above his station. From the moment they crossed the English Channel, she made it her mission to remind him of his place. When they stopped at inns, she refused to let Faraday eat at the same table as Sir Humphrey. While they discussed philosophy, Faraday was banished to the kitchen to eat with the maids. He was isolated in a painful limbo. He was too educated for the servants, who viewed him with suspicion, and too low-born for the Davys, who treated him like furniture. By day, Faraday stood shoulder to shoulder with Davy, helping him analyze iodine or using a burning glass to prove diamonds are made of carbon. He was engaging with the greatest scientific minds in Europe and earning their respect. But by night, he was brushing Davy's clothes and polishing his boots. The contrast was brutal. In his letters home, the pain bleeds through the ink. He wrote about his loneliness and the constant sting of Lady Davy's insults. He even considered quitting and walking back to London. But he didn't. He stayed for the science. He realized that the humiliation was the tuition fee he had to pay for the greatest education in the world. He swallowed his pride every time Lady Davy made a snide comment about his accent. He endured the cold nights in the servants' quarters and focused entirely on the work. He watched Davy closely, learning how to observe nature and how to think like a scientist. Crucially, he learned what kind of man he didn't want to be. He vowed that if he ever achieved greatness, he would remain humble. He would never treat another human being the way he was being treated. This crucible did not break him. It forged him. By 1815, Faraday was no longer a wide-eyed apprentice. He was a scientist tested in the fire. The year was 1820, and the scientific foundation of Europe was shaken by a discovery from Copenhagen. Hans Christian Ørsted noticed that an electric current flowing through a wire could deflect a magnetic compass needle. It was the first proof that electricity and magnetism were siblings. The news ignited a frenzy. Every scientist in the Royal Institution was trying to harness this invisible force. Among them was William Wollaston, a brilliant chemist who tried to build a motor. He failed repeatedly. In the background, Michael Faraday was quietly observing. He was 30 years old now. He watched the great men stumble. He didn't have their mathematical training, but that turned out to be his greatest advantage. He didn't think in equations. He thought in pictures. Where others saw abstract numbers, Faraday saw invisible lines of force swirling around the wire like a tornado. He believed that if he could isolate a single pole of a magnet, it would revolve around the wire endlessly. It was a radical idea born from a mind uncorrupted by rigid academic dogma. On September 3, 1821, Faraday tested his vision. He filled a small cup with mercury, a liquid metal that conducts electricity. In the center, he placed a bar magnet. Dangling above was a loose copper wire connected to a battery. It was a crude setup, looking more like a child's toy than a machine that would change history. He connected the battery, the current flowed, and then the magic happened. The wire didn't just twitch, it began to spin. It circled the magnet faster and faster, a blur of motion driven by an invisible wind. Faraday danced around the table, shouting, "There they go! We have succeeded at last." He had just invented the electric motor. In that basement, the blacksmith's son had birthed the ancestor of every fan, every electric car, and every hard drive that powers the modern world. He had converted electricity into motion. It was the greatest triumph of his life. But triumph is a dangerous thing. In his excitement, Faraday rushed to publish his results. He failed to specifically mention William Wollaston's earlier failed attempts. It was a breach of etiquette that the gentlemanly class of London could not forgive. The man leading the charge against him was his own mentor, Sir Humphrey Davy. Davy was the king of British science, but his star was fading while Faraday's was rising with blinding speed. Jealousy reared its head. Davy couldn't accept that his former valet had surpassed him. He accused Faraday of plagiarism. He spread rumors that Faraday had stolen ideas. It was a devastating betrayal. The man Faraday looked up to as a father figure was now trying to destroy his reputation. The conflict came to a head in 1824 when Faraday was nominated to join the Royal Society. Davy, furious, ordered him to withdraw. Faraday refused. On the day of the vote, the ballot box told the story. Faraday was elected almost unanimously. There was only one vote against him. It was cast by Sir Humphrey Davy. Davy could not stop the election, but he could stop the work. He assigned Faraday a new project that was practically impossible and utterly tedious: the improvement of optical glass for telescopes. It was a poison chalice. For the next 5 years, the greatest experimental genius of the century was forced to spend his days in a smoky glassworks. He stirred molten sand and ground lenses. It was grueling labor that yielded almost no results. Davy was sidelining his rival, burying Faraday's brilliance under a mountain of useless glass. For nearly a decade, the electric motor sat on a shelf. The secrets of electromagnetism remain unlocked because the man who held the key was being punished for his own genius. It was a slap that lasted for years. Faraday endured it with characteristic stoicism, but the tragedy remains. How many discoveries were lost during those wasted years? It wasn't until Davy died in 1829 that the shadow finally lifted. Michael Faraday was free to return to his lab, ready to unleash his next great revolution. By the summer of 1831, the smog-choked streets of London were vibrating with the thrum of steam engines. The Industrial Revolution was in full swing, devouring coal and vomiting black smoke. It was a civilization running on fire and water, but this steam-powered world was crude and limited. It was a civilization waiting for a cleaner heart. Michael Faraday was about to provide exactly that. With Davy's passing, the chains were broken. Faraday returned to the mysterious, invisible connection between electricity and magnetism. He knew that an electric current could create a magnetic field, but he believed in the unity of forces. If electricity could produce magnetism, surely magnetism could produce electricity. It seemed an elegant truth, yet every scientist who had tried to prove it had failed. They placed powerful magnets next to wires and waited for a spark. The wires remained dead. The academic elite decided the relationship was a one-way street. Faraday disagreed. He suspected the answer lay in change. On the morning of August 29, 1831, Faraday walked into his lab to alter the trajectory of the human species. He had constructed a device of deceptive simplicity. He took a soft iron ring and wound a coil of copper wire on one side, connected to a battery. On the opposite side, he wound a second coil attached to a galvanometer. The theory was simple. The magnetism from the first coil would travel through the iron ring and induce a current in the second coil. He closed the switch. What happened next was a blink-and-you-miss-it moment. The needle on the galvanometer jumped. It kicked violently to the side. But then, almost instantly, it swung back to zero. The current was gone. The battery was still connected, but the second coil was dead. Faraday did something brilliant. He opened the switch to disconnect the battery. At the precise moment the power was cut, the needle jumped again, but in the opposite direction. In that silent basement, Michael Faraday unlocked the secret of the universe. He realized that a magnet sitting still does nothing. Only the change matters. Current flowed only when the magnetic field was building up or breaking down. It was the wave of change that pushed the electrons. He had discovered electromagnetic induction. He had proven that magnetism could create electricity, but only if it was moving. He didn't stop there. He stripped the experiment down to its rawest form. He plunged a bar magnet into the center of a simple, hollow coil of wire. The needle jumped. He pulled the magnet out, and the needle jumped the other way. He was converting the mechanical motion of his arm directly into electrical power. This was no longer a chemical trick. It was the birth of the generator. Before August 1831, electricity was a curiosity, a parlor trick that was finite and weak. But Faraday's discovery meant that as long as you could keep a magnet moving, you could create an infinite river of electricity. He had handed humanity the keys to the power grid. When he demonstrated this, the Prime Minister asked, "What good is it?" Faraday replied with a prophecy. "Why, sir, there is every probability that you will soon be able to tax it." He was right. That iron ring was the direct ancestor of every power grid and smartphone charger on Earth. The greatest irony of Michael Faraday's career is that his greatest strength came from his greatest weakness. In the 19th century, physics was a language of advanced calculus. Elite scientists described the universe with complex equations. Faraday, who had left school at 13, couldn't read a word of it. To him, those equations were hieroglyphics. He was intellectually naked in a room full of heavily armored knights. But because he couldn't hide behind the math, he was forced to look at the world with his own eyes. While the mathematicians were busy calculating forces between points, Faraday was visualizing something entirely different. He sprinkled iron filings on a piece of paper over a magnet. They didn't just clump together. They arranged themselves in perfect, arcing curves from pole to pole. Faraday saw something real. He saw invisible lines physically filling the air around the magnet. He called them lines of force. He imagined them as elastic bands, stretching, bending, and vibrating. When he moved a magnet near a wire, he was disturbing these invisible lines. That vibration was what pushed the electrons. This was a radical, heretical idea. In the 1840s, the scientific establishment scoffed at him. They believed in action at a distance. Faraday's idea of a field sounded like mysticism. They dismissed his drawings as crude and his theories as amateurish. For years, Faraday stood alone. He knew he was right because he could feel it in his experiments, but he lacked the language to translate his intuition into the laws of physics. It wasn't until a young Scottish mathematician named James Clerk Maxwell entered the scene that the bridge was finally built. Maxwell was a Cambridge-educated prodigy, but unlike the snobs of the Royal Society, Maxwell respected Faraday. He read Faraday's work not with skepticism, but with awe. Maxwell realized that Faraday's lines of force were not metaphors. They were precise geometric descriptions of reality. Maxwell translated Faraday's pictures into calculus. The result was Maxwell's equations, the four pillars of modern electromagnetism. When Maxwell finished, he didn't claim the glory. He declared to the world that the math merely proved what the bookbinder had seen decades earlier. Faraday's field theory was the fundamental fabric of the universe. The man who couldn't solve a simple equation had outvisioned the greatest mathematicians of his age. In 1836, Faraday performed an experiment that was as much performance art as science. He built a wooden cube, 12 feet square, in the lecture theater of the Royal Institution. He covered every inch of it with metal foil and wire mesh. He then stepped inside this cage, bringing his most sensitive instruments. Outside, his assistants blasted the cage with high-voltage electricity. Sparks flew, crackling against the metal skin like a lightning storm. To the audience, it looked like a death trap. But inside, Faraday sat in perfect silence. His instruments didn't twitch. He was proving a fundamental principle, that an electric charge dwells only on the outside of a conductor. The interior remained a sanctuary of silence. He had invented what the world now calls the Faraday cage. Today, this principle protects hospital equipment and passengers inside an airplane struck by lightning. He was standing inside the storm, safe in the knowledge of his own laws. But Faraday's greatest shield wasn't made of copper. It was made of his own unshakable morality. As his fame grew, so did the temptations of power. The British government came to him with a dark request during the Crimean War. They wanted him to use his genius to develop chemical weapons. It was a request that many scientists would have accepted in the name of patriotism. But Faraday believed that science was a way to reveal creation, not to destroy it. He looked the generals in the eye and refused. He would not turn his laboratory into a slaughterhouse. This wasn't the only time he said no. Queen Victoria offered him a knighthood. He refused. He said he wanted to remain plain Michael Faraday to the end. They offered him the presidency of the Royal Society. He refused that too. He didn't want power. He didn't want titles. He didn't want money. He died as he had lived, a man of simple means, leaving behind a legacy not of wealth, but of light. He was the conscience of science, a reminder that the pursuit of knowledge must always be guided by humanity. The end of Michael Faraday's life was a slow, quiet fading of the light. The man who had seen the universe in a grain of sand began to lose his memory. It started small, but soon it became a fog that swallowed entire days. For a man who lived for clarity and precise observation, this descent into confusion was a silent torture. He described it as a decaying of the mental powers. He retired to a house at Hampton Court, where he spent his final years watching sunsets he could no longer explain. On August 25, 1867, Michael Faraday died in his chair. He had given strict instructions for his funeral. There was to be no grand procession and no marble monument in Westminster Abbey. He was buried in Highgate Cemetery, beneath a simple headstone, next to his beloved wife, Sarah. It was the final act of a man who chose to remain a servant of nature rather than a master of men. But his true monument is not made of stone. It is written in the fabric of the world we live in. Every time you flip a light switch, every time you charge your phone, you are paying tribute to the bookbinder's apprentice. There is a story that on the day of his funeral, the industries of England considered turning off the electricity for 1 minute in his honor. But they couldn't.